Brendan and I affirm, our democracy is on a path to collapse. Alan 22 explains that current institutions are neither responsive to evolving needs nor representative of shifting demographics, with global lows in productive policies and global highs in polarization. On this path, the American experiment's end is inevitable. Implementing ranked choice voting is the most concrete solution to revitalize our democracy, and thus we affirm. Contention 1 is minority representation. The current system of voting excludes women and people of color from running for office. Rel 21 explains that candidates from marginalized groups are often pressured to drop out of elections as parties see them as spoilers. Ranked choice voting is the solution. Rel 21 explains that ranked choice voting allows voters to reallocate their vote to their second option when their first choice is eliminated and so on. This eliminates the spoiler effect problem, giving candidates from marginalized communities a chance to run for office. This has already been proven. Sean 18 quantifies it and states that adopted RCV, the likelihood of women being elected increased by 14%. Minority representation is crucial for democracy. Watson 21 of Johns Hopkins University explains that candidates from marginalized groups are much more likely to pass civil rights legislation, which directly gives a voice to millions of voters that have traditionally been ignored by policymakers. With that, our second contention is reducing polarization. Polarization in America is at an all-time high. Schneider 18 finds that the current political climate in the U.S. is the most divided since the Civil War. Put simply, extremism and hatred is rapidly eroding our democracy. Luckily, RCV reduces polarization in two ways. Simply is rewarding moderation. RCV rewards candidates for embracing compromise. Lyon 21 explains that under RCV, candidates have a strong incentive to pick up crucial second or third place votes in order to win a majority. To do this, Hadid 20 explains that candidates must appeal to the voters outside of their voter base and even voters on the other side of the aisle. In other words, candidates must be less extreme and more moderate to win the widest array of voters. This is empirically proven, as Hill 22 finds that Alaska State Senate after RCV was implemented, moderates in both parties broke away from the extremist counterparts and officially created a moderate coalition because they realized it was more strategic for re-election. That's key, as moderation is the solution to reducing polarization and gridlock. Wolek 22 explains that moderates are much more likely to compromise on partisan issues than extremists. Compromise is not only key to breaking gridlock, but also reducing hatred. Huddy 20 finds that compromise brings the two sides together and reduces animosity between the two sides of the spectrum, leading to less gridlock. This has already worked. Morani 21 finds that Santa Fe City Council saw a 90% decrease in legislative gridlock after adopting RCV. That said, subpoint B is negative campaigning. RCV reduces the use of hateful rhetoric in elections. Julish 21 explains that under RCV, candidates become more civil because of the incentive to secure second place votes. Therefore, candidates must not actively attack their opponents, as that would alienate voters from other voting blocks. This is historically proven, as Tolbert 15 finds in a study that voters in RCV cities reported 500% less negative campaigning compared to non-RCV cities. Negative campaigning is a key factor of polarization. Sanders 21 explains that when people buy into the belief that the other side are enemies and evil, the public becomes far more polarized. Overall, the impact of polarization is twofold. First, polarization erodes representation. McGiff 22 finds that under high polarization, centrist voters are forced to vote for the lesser of two evils despite neither representing their views. Ingraham 21 finds that 62% of all Americans feel like the polarized system does not reflect their views, translating to 160 million silent voices. Second, polarization leads to gridlock. Abafe explains that polarization makes enacting any legislation nearly impossible due to the absence of compromise. Gridlock effectively shuts America down, yielding deadly consequences. For example, Kincaid 21 of LC finds that gridlock caused a lack of centralized response to COVID, directly causing death rates to be 60% higher than any other developed nation, which represented hundreds and thousands of excess deaths. Another example is climate change action. Williams 22 finds that gridlock has imperiled U.S. climate action, making the U.S. severely fail at meeting global standards, and therefore unable to pressure other countries to reduce emissions worldwide. Climate inaction is detrimental. Absent action, Phillips 21 finds that climate change would cause over 10 million deaths by 2030 and put 700 million people globally into severe drought. For all of these reasons, we affirm. Thank you.
Everyone good? Starts now. We negate contention 1 is representing America. American voter participation is at an all-time high, as the Pew Research Institute in 2022 writes that since states are increasing legislation to improve ballot access and mail-in voting, American voter turnout has soared, with 2020 election hitting the highest turnout of the 21st century and continuing in the following midterms. Devastatingly, RCV disenfranchises minority voters in two key ways. First is ballot exhaustion. Landsman 16 finds that ballot exhaustion occurs when all the candidates that a voter ranked have lost and the ballot is no longer included in determining the winner of the election. Ballot exhaustion primarily impacts minority voters, as Burnett 14 finds that ballot exhaustion affects disadvantaged socioeconomic groups more than others, systemically reducing their participation. Critically, in response to high rates of ballot exhaustion among disadvantaged voters, politicians shifted their policies to favor middle-class voters. Overall, FGA writes that up to 53% of ballots are exhausted under RCV. Across more than 600,000 ballots in RCV elections, the rate of ballot exhaustion ranged from 9.6% to 27.1%. Second is despoiled ballots. Due to process confusion, SciGout 18 finds that RCV ballots are more likely to be incorrectly filled out than single-choice voting elections. Empirically, this was seen in Minneapolis and San Francisco when millions of ballots were deemed invalid and not counted. Ballot spoilage disproportionately impacts low-income Americans, as Rice 13 confirms that in wealthy areas, the percentage of ballot error is only 2%, while in low-income neighborhoods that number balloons to approximately 20%. Overall, RB 23 confirms that ranked choice voting increases the chance of ballot spoilage by 700%. These two flaws are devastating for effective welfare policy. Etzel 22 explains that due to disenfranchisement, elections are inaccurate, as 60% of RCV victors did not win majorities of the total votes cast due to ballots being thrown out. McElwee 15 finds that increased voter participation boosts the size and scope of the welfare state by making politicians beholden to more diverse voting bases. Empirically, women's suffrage coincided with increased state spending by 100%, saving 20,000 children annually with enlarged healthcare benefits. And Husted reports that during the 1970s, increased voter access expanded the welfare system in 46 states. Contention 2 is the GOP. In the status quo, conservatives remain strongly against RCV. Weagle 23 reports that far-right incumbents such as Sarah Palin and Kelly Tshibaka have allegedly lost their re-elections because of RCV. In response, many far-right politicians have pushed a narrative that RCV favors Democrats, which is why Weagle confirms that the GOP has passed a formal resolution to collectively oppose RCV. Affirming exacerbates Republican propaganda, as SR 23 explains that in comparison to traditional ballots, RCV ballots are longer and take more time to complete, causing delays and longer lines at the polls. FGA 22 furthers that RCV requires the presence of all ballots in a congressional district in one place before counting can begin. The transportation of the ballots is not only extremely time-consuming, but also increases the cost of the election and the chance of mismanagement. Thus, FGA continues that RCV elections are rarely finished by election day, often taking weeks to tabulate. Critically, FGA confirms that even minor delays in election results spark concerns of impropriety and significantly impact voter confidence. Indeed, when informed that RCV increases election irregularities, 71% of all voters were more likely to oppose RCV. These worsened delays would be especially catastrophic within the GOP, as Marley 22 reports that Trump and his supporters took advantage of long election delays to whip up their false claims of a rigged process. The impact is political violence. Kleinfeld 21 laments that the narrative of a stolen election increases support for political violence, which directly caused the January 6th insurrection. Those who believe the narrative were far more likely to endorse coups and armed rebellion. As such, the New York Times 22 terminalizes that political violence forms a social scaffolding that allows for the death of democracy, which the U.S. University of Tennessee 19 concludes would result in autocracy. Kasparov 16 writes that authoritarianism has a laundry list of harms, including lower levels of health and life expectancy, higher susceptibility to famine, and constant war with a foreign power and with their own people. Thus, we are proud to negate.
We have the impact.
Alright, are you ready to start the question?
Yep.
Can I take the first question?
Yep.
Alright. Can you explain the methodology of your argument under voter confidence? Like 70% of people oppose RCV after they're told it's delayed.
Because we saw this in 2020, even before RCV was implemented with the conventional voting system, where the elections were delayed because they were multiple recounts.
I mean, the methodology of the study, like not the argument.
The methodology of the study of 70%.
Yeah.
Well, they polled a bunch of people.
Well, what did they tell these people?
They told these people that if RCV's elections were delayed, then there would be an extra time between the tabulation and the results.
No, the researchers went to a few cities and polled like a very limited group of people in small districts and asked them if RCV was delayed for more than 2-3 weeks, how would you react? And they said they didn't like it, which is obviously going to be true, right?
Well, yes, that's what we're saying. Obviously, that's true.
Okay, sure. Do you want to take a cross?
Okay. So let's talk about this argument on more climate, actually no, let's talk about COVID. When is the next pandemic going to happen?
The next pandemic?
Right.
Probably in a few years, right? We're seeing pandemics come up every 10 years, right? We had SARS 10 years ago with COVID now. And even if it's not pandemics, like not having a united government response to any problem is the worst thing we could have. Like climate change is one of the big things, even if it's not about diseases. There's so many things that we can't pass, which is making our government like decline in power. Can I take a question?
Sure.
All right, at the top of your case, you say that 2020 had the highest turnout in years. So what was the conditions of the 2020 election?
The conditions of the 2020 election? If we had our conventional voting system that we have now.
Okay, so wasn't it the first election after COVID, or like after COVID pretty much ended?
I mean, sure, but the card that we give you is comparing the
understand. But when COVID ended, people obviously came out to vote, correct? Because it was
yes,
after a
that's what the
pandemic
card
for
says.
years where they didn't vote. So obviously we would have the highest numbers, right? This is just one instance.
I mean, this card that we're reading is comparing the number of voters that are turning out over multiple years, even before COVID.
No, that's not what your study says. Your study is looking at the 2022 midterms.
Right, but it's comparing those numbers to past numbers over the past decade.
All right, my argument is
But
that
can I take a
because it's COVID, it's delayed. But yeah, go ahead.
Also, what's our vote? So on the extremism, so you say that there's going to be less extremism because it rewards second and third place votes. If every moderate is getting a second place vote, doesn't that mean they're instantly eliminated from the runoff?
I mean, that's definitely not true. If we look at every empiric of RCV in the US, in Alaska, we saw Portola get elected, one of the most moderate Democrats you're ever going to see. In New York, you saw Adams get elected. In all of these states, we virtually see every moderate come into power compared to the past where they didn't have much control. And you can also look to the special Senate election in Alaska, where most of the moderates won.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Okay. Do you need time?
I got it. Okay, is anyone not ready? Starting under C1. Under C1, 3 overview responses. First, you can turn the argument RCV helps minorities by forming coalitions. Garepis-Holland 21 finds that ranked splitting allows for more minority candidates to vote without splitting the vote, which means that minorities can form coalitions where votes will be reallocated to other second-choice minority candidates, which increase the amount of minorities being voted into office. Second, empirics prove, Garepis-Holland 21 finds in a study across 19 RCV cities that women won elections in high numbers, winning half the mayoral and nearly half the city council positions, a significant increase from the 30% nationwide. 3, you can turn the argument again. RCV motivates candidates to appeal to minorities. Garepis-Holland finds that ranked voting requires candidates to speak of larger coalitions, meaning that candidates must appeal to minority groups and be more attentive to their needs. With that said, under subpoint A, one can deal with the argument even in jurisdictions that limit the number of ranks, votes still have more say in traditional elections. In traditional elections, voting for a weaker candidate, a third rank candidate means that the vote has no influence over the real race between the top 2 candidates. Meanwhile, under ranked voting elections, at least there's a high chance that supporters of a weak candidate or third-party candidate can now influence the final race between the 2 parties through the reallocation of their votes. Second, you can deal with the argument. They say that most votes go spoiled. That is not true. Empirically, in Maine, Russia 23 finding that 95% of the ballots remain active in the final round. That said, under subpoint B, 4 responses here. First, you can turn an argument. Ranked voting produces more valid ballots. Fairvote 22 quotes Maui 20 in finding that ranked voting elections had more valid ballots than traditional elections, meaning that voters understood ranked voting fine. The warnings of the second response where it finds that voters get used to ranked voting very, very quickly. Shaman 21 finds that studies overestimate ranked voting difficulty for voters because it's so new in most places. However, in places where RCV was adopted for more than 5 years, most voters start finding RCV very, very straightforward. 4, you can deal with the argument again as ranked voting comes with high voter education. In New York City, $15 million was spent on voter education to ensure every citizen knows how to vote. In Maine, a 19-page manual was published. All of this means that voters know how to vote the moment that few elections start getting passed. Empirics on our side. Their argument is historically untrue. Top 14 finds that the percentage of voters who self-reportedly understand traditional voting is 84% across the nation. However, in RCV jurisdictions, 90% of voters across the nation found RCV very, very easy to understand. That's also 95% in New York City, 92% in Minneapolis, and 90% in Maine, which all shows that currently people understand ranked voting very, very fine, and these full power problems will be existing at least now and into the future. That said, under C2 on GOP, first, on that data, there'll be delays. 4 key responses here. First, that is non-unique. The rise of absentee ballots and mail-in ballots right now mean that traditional election systems also see weeks to produce a formal winner. That's not unique to RCV. But second, ranked voting is literally just basic addition. Math 22 finds the actual tabulation of ranked voting takes literally just seconds. It is not a unique reason why there's delays. 3, the only card that they talk about delays comes from a study on Alaska. But the Alaska example can't be applied because Macro 22 finds that Alaska's unique state law in Alaska allows for election results to come out after 15 days. That is why even before ranked voting was adopted, Alaska's Senate election took 15 days to produce a winner. Ranked voting changed nothing. 4, ranked voting is better than alternative, which is runoff elections. Rose 22 finds that runoffs are held up to 40 days after the initial primary election, which is far bigger delay. Ranked voting solves by eliminating the idea of runoffs altogether. 5, their problem is very, very short term. As ranked voting continues to be used on the local level, procedures and technologies have already been developed to shorten the processing times. Minutes 23 reports in Minneapolis, enough tabulation staff was hired to count the results for 4 different races concurrently, and the results were announced by 5 p.m. on the day of election. That said, On the GOP backlash, 3 responses here. 1, we are prerequisite to the argument. Solving polarization solves our fraud claims because under rankless voting, the moderate Republicans will be the one that gets rewarded, which means that by being the one that caused fraud and being an extremist Republican, you won't win elections, which is why the Republican Party will try to be more moderate and thus not calling fraud in every single election. Second, the Republicans are too divided right now to exploit this opportunity. The Article 23 finds the Republican Party is still split over Trump and similar candidates, making it messy, internally divided. There's no way they split between whether it's fraud or not right now. 3, the Republicans already deeply distrust the system and are trying to overturn it in the status quo. Every single election in 2016, 2020, and 2022, we have fraud claims. There's nothing unique on their side. For those reasons, affirm.
This is going to start on our case, to their case. Time starts now. So the top of our case, they tell you that RCV helps minorities by forming coalitions. This is just a cross-up of their case. I'll get to it on their flow. Okay, on ballot exhaustion, they tell you that that 95% of main ballots were active in the final round. This is their only response, but prefer our holistic study that doesn't only study Maine. It tells you that on average, it's 9% to 27% of ballots that are exhausted. That's 9% to 27% of people who don't have a voice. It's usually minority voters. Okay, on spoiled ballots, they tell you that RCV had more valid ballots than traditional elections, but again, not on minorities. 20% of minorities saw spoiled ballots. That's way higher than anything else. You're going to prefer minorities because those are the people that need legislation the most. They need help the most. Okay. Then they tell you that RCV is going to come with high voter education, but we see that that's not true empirically. Otherwise, you wouldn't see these high numbers of ballot spoilage. Then they say on spoiled ballots, again, they say that 90% of voters nationwide understand RCV. Again, drop this because that wouldn't be the case if empirically we saw data. So they can say whatever they want on like whether or not you ask people if they understand RCV, but if people aren't doing RCV properly, then it doesn't work. Okay, then they drop everything past that point on voter participation increasing. So flow through everything on voter participation improves welfare by 100%. Everything we have in welfare flows through if they don't respond to it. On GOP, they said 4 responses. First, that delays are non-unique, but it's a scalar impact. Delays will get worse, and the key is that the perception will get worse. That's true when they say that RCV tabulation takes no time. Even if RCV could be good theoretically, and they have the technology to do it right now, we still see Republicans oppose it in the status quo. So if Republicans oppose RCV, which according to them is a perfect system, then we can imagine that it doesn't matter if RCV is a perfect system if Republicans are going to oppose it anyway. And you're going to see all of our impacts of Republicans like threatening democracy continue. Okay, and then they say that RCV is better than the alternative of runoffs, but runoffs don't happen in the majority of states. It's 20% of states actually use runoffs, so that isn't like wide scale. And then on the prereq, they say that moderate Republicans will be rewarded under RCV, so there won't be these claims of fraud. But they don't prereq here because as soon as we implement RCV, the current Republicans in government are extreme, and they're going to be the ones that like rally against RCV. So they don't prereq. We actually prereq here. Okay, on our side of the floor. At the top, they say that the current Democratic institutions are bad, but we tell you this is the all-time highest voter turnout thanks to increased access. On minority representation, we would tell you that it's more important that we see increased voter registration, increased voter numbers. So while RCV, according to them, like increases the amount of minorities that could run, it doesn't increase the amount of minorities that get elected. But we see that under RCV, fewer minorities are able to have their votes count. That matters more. On reducing polarization, we tell you that RCV leads to more polarization. Stream 22 explains that many voters choose not to vote for more extreme candidates because they think there's no chance they will win. Hence, they choose to vote for a moderate candidate that they believe will win. Since RCV offers a second choice, voters will be able to vote for the previously unelectable extreme candidate without feeling like their ballot is wasted. We tell you that RCV hurts moderates because other candidates start viewing moderates as a threat. Period 22 explains this is because moderates are leading with second place votes. All other candidates have an incentive to ensure that the moderate loses in the first round so that the moderate wouldn't win. Atkinson 22 explains that this happened in Alaska's election because the moderate Begich had less first choice votes but more second choice votes. He was knocked out while the more extreme Pelota won the election. In other words, even if the moderate has more widespread support, extremes will win because extremists will conspire against moderates so that they can't win the election. This occurs empirically in places like Alaska. On civility, they say that like under RCV you see more civil elections. This isn't true. Ranked choice voting increases negative campaign spending. Clark 21 confirms negative spending increased significantly in Maine following the implementation of ranked choice voting. And the 2018 campaign was even more negative than in paired districts across the country. And also negative campaigning is non-unique. Cites Brown 22 writes Australia used RCV for decades and it still has negative ads. Okay, and then on their impact on climate, U.S. climate policy can't change the practices of other big emitters like China and India. They have no solvency for extinction. And also, non-unique, Congress already passed the Inflation Reduction Act without a single Republican vote, which Forbes 22 finds will cut carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. The U.S. is already attempting to solve climate change without the need of Republicans. RCV doesn't solve because it's already being solved, and even if it does solve, it won't matter because India and China are already the biggest emitters. For those reasons, we urge a calm down. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So you say that Pratola was an extremist, right?
Yeah, or Pelota, yeah.
Okay, so can you
more
tell me?
extremist candidate, yeah.
Can you tell me one extreme policies that she's done?
I can tell you that they are the more extreme candidate of the three that ran. It's a three-person election, and they were the more extreme.
So what more extreme things did she do?
I can get you that later if you want.
Okay, well, I know a lot of moderate things that she does. Like, her entire cabinet and administration has Republicans in it, and she's a Democrat leader. And also, she's a Democrat, but she's pro-compromising on guns and oil in favor of things like climate change and other goals.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Sure.
Can I get a question?
Sure.
Sure. Okay, so you tell us that. You tell us that 95% of main ballots are active,
Yeah.
ballot exhaustion isn't an issue. But can you explain why, if the 20% of minority votes aren't being counted in the final round, which is what determines the winner, why that isn't a problem when those people need it most?
Sure, because 95% doesn't mean that 95% were their only valid votes. The rest of the 5% were valid votes. They just decided to not rank every single candidate.
But that
That's
means-
perfectly fine.
That means their vote counted less.
and it's
not.
still more say than what we have right now. Because right now, if I vote for a candidate that's not in the top two, I have zero say over who wins in the top two. At least with ranked choice voting, 95% of people, despite voting for other people, has a say in the top two.
No, sure, but would you not agree that ranked choice voting then gives a false security that you can vote for a moderate or vote for somebody who is less likely to be elected, therefore reducing the quality of your vote if you're not educated?
Well, you can vote for a moderate, which is why we're
Or not
So
moderate.
moderate.
I meant a less electable person. If you vote for a less electable person and not rank a more electable person, then you're it's false voter security.
So that's very good, because traditionally what we see as more electable are either people in the white majority
Okay.
are more electable, or extremist candidates like Trump with a lot of personal appeal. These were more electable. It's only under active voting where you can vote for the less electable people through moderates and minorities win.
But then, if you vote for those less electable people and you don't vote for a more electable person, and you see that that is the case predominantly in minorities, then their votes count less because those less electable people just don't
And it's still
matter.
much more than what we have right now.
Is it at all anymore? Because their votes don't count.
Right
It doesn't
now-
matter if they vote for if you rank the person who's going to come in third, and that's all you do. You rank third, fourth, and fifth, and the people that got in first and second, then your vote doesn't actually matter at all because if you come in first and second, that's all that matters.
And your
to determine
votes
the winner.
don't matter at all right now. If you go for someone who's fifth, your votes don't matter and who wins the top two.
You're right, except that there's no false security in the current system. We can talk about that later.
Sure. All right. Was that your question?
That was my question.
Okay, sure. All right. On the current turnout increase, so what's the current turnout number right now?
You mean
Like, what was the turnout in the last election, 2022?
Sure. Do you have a number? We're talking about 2020. I can get the number.
Okay, sure. Well, it was an increase after a huge decrease during COVID. So comparatively to 2008 or 2000.
No, it's all time. The highest voter turnout all time because it's increased mail.
Okay, well, I'm gonna need that card and that number.
Sure.
So, all right. Okay.
All right, is everyone good?
I appreciate that. Better we can do is stick at the tab.
Yeah, of course. I'm not good at math.
Okay.
All right, so I'll start on my case, but I'll handle minorities on their case, doing the comparison and then their case. Everyone good? All of our arguments are true, but the most important one is moderation. The argument is simple. Lyon explains that under RCV, candidates have to moderate because they need to secure second place votes by appealing to the most number of people. Overall, Huddy finds that moderates compromise more in every scenario. There is less polarization and gridlock because of that, shown by RCV's ability to decrease legislative gridlock by 90% in Santa Fe. That's key for two reasons. One, McGriff finds that under a polarized system, 160 million centrist voters are denied a candidate that actually represents them. Secondly, Kincaid finds that polarization leads to policy paralysis, preventing action that led to millions of deaths during COVID. There's no impact defense on any of these. They flow cleanly through. They say a couple of things. First, they say that moderates don't win because they're the second choice. Secondly, they say that people start targeting moderates. You can group both of them. They're the same response, but you should look to them pairs. Adams in New York City, Pertola in Alaska, virtually all RCV cities elected the most moderate candidate they could evaluate. And also prefer this over their theoretical think tank cards because our arguments are actually grounded in the states that implemented RCV, but all of theirs are just think tanks who argue about how moderates would be targeted. Even if you don't buy that, you can look to Alaska where moderates from both sides formed coalition and kicked out the extremists from their own party, which means that moderates stay together because they want to win re-election. They say that Pertola is an extremist, but that's not true. She's the most moderate Democrat you can ever find. She has Republicans working in her Democrat. She's pro-gun rights with restrictions. She's pro-oil compromising through all the climate action. There's no way you're gonna buy that. Lastly, on negative campaigning, they say that negative campaigning goes up, but no, they've conceded our October evidence, which finds that negative campaigning went down by 500% nationwide. Prefer our evidence over theirs because their evidence only looks at Maine, while ours is a nationwide study. Also, spending does not mean anything. If candidates are running, of course there's more spending, but overall there's less negativity per candidate, which means that negative spending as a whole isn't as big of a problem. If we win this argument, we win the round for a couple of reasons. First of all, our prereq that was read in rebuttal was pretty much dropped. We tell you that low polarization means lower fraud claims and Republicans won't backlash, which solves for their argument. They just repeat their case as a response, but this isn't responsive at all. I'll talk about it there. Secondly, we link into their impact because less polarized parties means centrists and minorities get more representation. Our impact we've given you since case is 160 million. It's the only quantified thing. Third of all, we outweigh on time frame. Long-term effects of gridlock versus short-term problems like confusion. You should obviously prefer long-term effects. Fourth of all, we're more probable. RCV has been a success in every state, while their fear-mongering is all theoretical. At this point, let's talk about their case. They've conceded way too many responses to win this round. On the representation argument, first of all, they've agreed that under RCV, candidates have to appeal to minorities, increasing their turnout representation, which means that if you want to vote for them, you should vote here. On their exhaustion argument, they've conceded that voters get more say under RCV because their ballots get passed down. On spoiled ballots, there's two things. One, voter education comes with RCV. They say it doesn't happen, but it did. New York spent $15 million on it. Secondly, we tell you that there's less confusion because there's a 10% increase in voting with the RCV. They say it's not empirical, but it's a study in all the our states. On the GOP argument, they've conceded that new technology is shortening delays. In Maine, the results were out on the same day of voting, and the GOP won't backlash because they're already distrusting them. For these reasons, we affirm.
The order is just going to be our case weighing their case. Our time starts now. The cleanest place to vote is our second argument on the GOP. Conservatives oppose RCV in the status quo, as Weagle 23 explains that far-right incumbents such as Sarah Palin and Kelly Shibaka blame RCV for electoral losses, pushing the narrative that RCV favors Democrats. Implementing RCV on the federal level only exacerbates Republican propaganda by delaying the election because RCV ballots take a longer time to complete at the polls, and second, because RCV repels all ballots in one place before counting can begin. They try to tell you that the technology exists right now for RCV elections to be fast. However, this just proves our argument that Republicans, regardless of how good technology is, they're just going to keep pushing this narrative that elections will be slow, which means that you're still going to see all this fear-mongering within the GOP that's going to cause our impact of political violence, which is that in Marley 22 writes that Trump and his supporters used election delays to whip up claims of a false process. This card goes clean conceded. And Kleinfeld 21 laments that the narrative of a stolen election increases support for coups and political violence overall. And this links into autocracy, causing lower levels of health and life expectancy, higher susceptibility to famine, laundry lists. But then on the way, our impact comes before any impact that they tell you, because all of their impacts require there to be a successful RCV election without any kind of backlash. So on minorities, they tell you that more moderates will be elected and then we'll be able to help minorities. However, if the democratic system completely collapses because Republicans are rioting, that means you won't see any of these policies happening. But then on their side, for polarization, they try to read this prereq that their low polarization means no voter fraud. Again, right now, the Republicans who are in office believe that there would be voter fraud. So that means they're going to cause violence before moderates can get elected. But then they tell you on time frame to prioritize long-term. There is no long-term democracy if we see the collapse of it now. But then on their case, extend a few responses. So first on minorities, or on polarization. So they tell you that you need to secure second place votes, and so that's why moderates are going to win. However, the key warrant that they lose and mishandle is that moderates, if they only get second place votes, that means they're instantly eliminated from the runoff, and we literally saw this in Alaska. They try to tell you that Pertolta is moderate, but out of the candidates that were running, Pertolta was the most extreme one. But then they try to tell you that empirics disprove over theory, but it literally just makes sense that their empirics coexist with our empirics, which means that both scenarios can happen. Just because their scenario happened doesn't mean ours is impossible, which means that you're going to see more extremists get reelected, as well as some extremists losing sometimes, but either way, you're still going to see extremists in office. But then on negative campaigning, extend the non-unique that my partner reads about Alaska, how they've had ranked choice voting for ages. However, you still see the same levels of negative campaigning. They try to tell you that we don't have federal level studies. We literally have Australia to prove. On that, it's a really easy day.
Alright, y'all good for question?
Yeah.
Alright, can we take first question?
Yeah.
Can you name me one extremist RCV has elected?
Well, just now you said she was an extremist. She was just less moderate. So who was like her actual extremist? That's
She was the most extremist of the people.
Well, basically, the crux of your warrant is that the most extreme candidate will appeal to most voters across the spectrum. So even though, like, say, like Pertola isn't like a QAnon supporter or like a really extreme Republican, she was like one of the most extreme candidates in the entire race, which
Wait, really
disproves
quickly,
your
that's just
warrant
not true.
that
You
you need to
yourself-
appeal to the most voters who actually win the elections.
Okay, let me explain. You say yourself that extremists like Sarah Palin was running on your own argument, and they've lost. So I don't get what the contradiction is here. But even more
Right,
so,
but it's disproving
Sarah
your argument
Palin
that
is.
the most moderate
Yeah,
candidate
but
wins.
what you don't do is provide the warrant to prove that the reason why Sarah Palin lost was RCV, and that you don't provide that on your actual, like when you read responses to what we say. Sarah Palin lost because there's backlash
Okay,
against
so that
extremists
proves our
right now in the
argument.
country.
Extremists
That's
vote under
not,
RCV.
That's not about RCV, it's just that there's backlash in the country against extremists because we just dealt with Trump for 4 years. It's not about RCV at all.
Okay.
It's just that Sarah Palin is like Trump. It was the original Trump, right? Sarah
So
Palin
did
led the way to
RCV
Trump.
elect Sarah Palin or not?
I'm sorry?
Did RCV elect Sarah Palin or
Did
not?
RCV elect Sarah Palin? No, Sarah Palin was not on the RCV.
Okay, so RCV doesn't elect
But
extremists.
do you see how that is just like completely correlation, not an actual argument?
Exactly. The crux of the argument here is that the most moderate candidate doesn't win, which completely dismantles your warrant because you're saying that in order for because moderates are like more likely to win just because they appeal to the most like voters across
Wait,
the spectrum.
not at all.
But
Your
given
evidence
that the
says the
most
opposite.
moderate candidate lost the election, that means it's entirely plausible for other extreme candidates to win.
Also, we see that extreme
Alright.
candidates have
Wait, back up. Let me
turned
explain.
against moderates because they know that moderates will garner support from
Alright,
them.
here's the key distinction.
Sure.
You tell me that RCV will elect extremists, but that's not true shown through Sarah Palin. But even if we don't want to look at that empiric, we can look at other places like New York, where Adams was elected. Adams was the most moderate out of the entire pool. And even in Alaska, like a moderate one. We both agree on that. I don't see what the clash
Yeah,
is.
so
here.
our
You wanna take a
offense.
question?
I mean, what I said in summary is that like you have an empiric that a moderate one, but also we have an empiric that a more extreme candidate one, which means that both scenarios are entirely possible. You don't win the link that only moderates can win the election, which means you're still going to have extremists in office, which is hence why we still win this argument.
Okay,
Right,
so
the
your
crux
entire-
of the crux of
you-
winning this debate for you relies on you winning this.
I mean,
thing.
y'all are
That's
just
not the
making
case
arguments
for
off
us.
each other. I can like
Sure.
characterize this debate. So if that's the case, you should win this debate if you can prove that like Patola was an extremist,
No,
right?
we win this
Because you
debate,
say that
we win this
moderate
debate on
lost.
our side of the flow. You only win this debate if you can prove that moderates are always elected by RCV. Insofar as you haven't done that, you can't win your link
I think
chain.
we do.
We win
do
our
that
link
pretty
chain on
well.
our side of the flow. It
In
doesn't have to be
Alaska,
defensive
the
rules.
Senate elected a
We've been all
moderate.
this a while.
In Alaska, like all the moderates were elected in New York. That was always the case. Yeah, 4 seconds.
Wait, no, you took the 4 seconds.
Oh, my bad.
See, that 4 seconds was like life changing.
I'm sorry, man.
Alright, okay, it's gonna start in our case. Anyone not ready? Good. Extend our C2 subpoint A. Land explains that under righteous voting, candidates have to be moderate because they need to secure the second place votes and third place votes by appealing to the most number of people overall. Huddy finds that because moderate is compromised, there's less polarization and gridlock shown the RCV's ability to decrease legitimate gridlock by 90%. That's key as one, but Giff finds that under a polarized system, 160 million potential voters are denying candidates to represent them, which outweighs on scope. Second, Kincaid finds that polarization leads to policy paralysis, preventing action, and leads to millions of deaths during COVID and whatever next pandemic. They have one response. Their one response is that moderates don't win because they only get second place votes. That is one, uncarded, and second, just not true. They get all the first place votes. They concede every one in our case while moderates are rewarded. For example, moderates pick up second and third place votes in addition to first place, while extremists get ranked last in this scenario. For our case over there, Blippi responds via empirics. They can't give you a single extremist elected under righteous voting, but we give you many, many moderates. For example, Adams in New York City, Pertola in Alaska, and the entire Alaska Senate that decided to form a moderate coalition and alienated the radicals in the Senate. They say Pertola is extremist, but they said they concede every word why she's a moderate. She's a moderate candidate, and she has Republicans working in cabinet, and she's pro many Republican things for compromise with the Democrats. But at the end, it does doesn't matter if there's more moderate candidates. The fact that she is a moderate and last elected her shows the Rijksrevolutie produces moderates. On the weighing debate, we're cleanly weighing here. They have won the prereq that says we won't be seeing policies happening, but this is very short term. And also our prereq comes first because moderate Republicans will come in after a few elections, meaning that policies will be passed. Second, they say the Republicans in office don't believe right now. That's only in the current office. Think about one more election or the second election. This probably is very, very short term. Soon the moderate Republicans will replace the extremists, meaning that we will not only suffer all of their office, but also look in our case. Then they can see the most important time frame weighing that the long-term effects of gridlock versus the short-term problems like the current administration of the GOP means that we clearly outweigh on time frame. On their case, they can see two important pieces of defense. First, they can see the new technology showing delays and maybe the results were out on the same day. Their one response is that the GOP will keep pushing the narrative, but if the narrative is like literally not true and it's not slow, then the Republicans will be proven wrong. But second, they say the GOP backlashes, but they can see that the GOP is backlashing and distrusting the current election. They distrust the traditional election, they distrust the new election. There's no change, they have no offense.
This is going to be mainly weighing. Time goes to my time starts. Now, judges, the most important place to vote in this round is our contention, too, on the GOP. Our impact of the U.S. democratic system collapsing into authoritarianism, which is the largest one in the round, prereqs our opponent's impact because our opponent's impact relies on a successful RCV election. They concede this in their last speech, but before that can occur, the current extremist Republicans in government will inspire claims of impropriety in elections, which leads to political violence. This is empirically proven by our Weigel 23 card conceded. The New York Times 22 finds that political violence leads to the death of democracy, which Tennessee 19 concludes results in autocracy. This entire link chain of autocracy is dropped. So even if you think that like the U.S. backsliding to democracy is not something that's going to happen, they drop it, they agree with it. Okay. Autocracy results in lower levels of health and life expectancy, higher susceptibility to famine, and a constant war with a foreign power and their own people is the biggest impact in this round. Our opponent's impact is solving for climate change through solving polarization. There are a ton of issues with this argument. First is that RCV doesn't solve for polarization insofar as they haven't proven to you that only moderates can win under RCV. Moreover, they haven't responded to our response, which is that climate change is being solved for in the status quo because you don't actually need Republicans, you don't actually need RCV moderates to solve for climate change. We see that the US is already solving for it. Moreover, they dropped that India and China are big global emitters and that climate change won't be solved unless they contribute as well. Also remember that climate change is being solved for in the status quo. Okay. Let's just do some more weighing for the final 30 seconds. Their impact is climate change solvency, and our impact is autocracy. Now, both of these seem like massive impacts, right? Huge amounts of death, whatever. But the problem with their impact is that climate change solvency is all about time frame. We see the U.S. backsliding into autocracy as soon as the first RCV federal election is implemented. Climate change, we don't know when we're going to see these climate change impacts happen. They tell you that climate change is this big issue. We haven't seen these actual deaths from climate change or any of their impacts. We tell you that historically, autocracy is going to result in deaths, famine. Every bad laundry list of authoritarianism occurs as soon as it is implemented. For these reasons, we urge very hard.
Good round, yo. And thank the three of you for judging. Appreciate it.